Yo, it's your boy Logos. And today I want to react to Thomas Sowell explain why Britain advanced before other European nations. I'm very curious to figure out or find out his reasoning behind it. For my military knowledge, I would say it's because it's an island nation. It's a very central place where trade routes go near it. They had access to Roman technology before it collapsed. They was able to get the benefits of Roman technology and have Roman government and other type of stabilizing factors like Hadrian's Wall. I think that's Hadrian's Wall, or other, economic or political military factors like that. And even in his book I'm reading now, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, he talks about how having Roman civilization advanced Britain before Ireland and Scotland. So I wonder if you're going to go more into that or if it's something completely different. Let's get into it. I'm gonna have to check that book out, Conquest and Culture.
Patterns of conquest have not been determined solely by technology or even by culture in general. Geography, including disease environments, has played a major role in the history of conquest, as it has in the history of cultural evolution in general.
Here's an interesting fact. Disease killed more soldiers probably than anything else. Disease, or rather, is not fighting. Most fighting don't even, not most dying on the battlefield doesn't happen until one side runs away. So when it first clash, not many people die. It's more about trying to get the other one to be so afraid, or you get their flank, or they get afraid of being encircled, and then they run away, and then their back is exposed where they not got their shield or protection, and then they get killed. But before that even happens, many armies are losing soldiers every single day due to disease. And then simple diseases too that we deal with today that we just have cures for, like dysentery.
The steppes of Central Asia and the plains of Eastern Europe have been far better settings for cavalry charges than the mountainous terrain of the Balkans or the heavily forested parts of Central Europe, while
Sorry, but that's where you get the Mongols, that's where you get Attila the Hun, that's where you get Timur, that's where the Turks, kind of more south, but they have very good cavalry too. But that's where a lot of the cavalry conquering warlords that we know about, like Genghis Khan, came from.
island nations such as Britain and Japan have of course been wholly immune. China tried to create the effects of natural barriers with its Great Wall, as Hadrian's Wall in Britain and the Maginot Line in pre-war France attempted the same thing on a smaller scale. Geographic barriers have spared some peoples from conquest or delayed its coming. Mountainous terrain has permitted independence to persist in some places long after the adjoining lowlands have been overrun by invaders. Morocco, Ceylon, Abyssinia, Scotland, and Tibet are just some of the places in which this has been so.
Which is also part of the reason why the Romans couldn't get to Scotland. It's a lot of factors, but the terrain in of itself is a big indication of battlefields and who will win or lose. Sun Tzu emphasized this so much in The Art of War. I just finished reading that book a couple days ago, and it's a very good book. That's how I'm able to get on the Thomas Sowell book now, because I'm finally able to finish The Art of War.
However, geographical barriers have been a mixed blessing, as technological and cultural backwardness have likewise been the fates of many of these isolated regions. Moreover, the relative poverty of such regions has also been one of the deterrents to conquest, along with the fighting abilities of mountain men, for there was little or no profit to be had from the conquest of many such areas. Differential resistance to one another's diseases, which played a key role in the conquest of the Western Hemisphere, retarded the conquest of Africa until much later in history, because it was the indigenous peoples who succumbed to new, mixed disease environments in the Americas, while it was the Europeans who were fatally vulnerable to the diseases of tropical Africa until quinine and other modern medical and public health measures made it possible for them to survive amid the tropical diseases that flourished south of the Sahara. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans long protected the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere from the conquerors of the rest of the world, And, even as late as the first half of the 20th century, these oceans made isolationism a viable option for the United States, as it was not
Hmm.
for most of the nations of Europe or Asia.
Never
However,
was.
smaller bodies of water may facilitate.
Outside of Japan, it never was possible for a Asian or European nation to be isolation. Like even Great Britain, they got conquered by Rome eventually.
Rather than impede military attacks, for huge differences between the high cost of land transport and the low cost of water transport can be as important militarily as it has been economically. During the Crimean War, for example, the British and the French attacking forces were supplied by water, while the Russian defenders at Sevastopol had to be supplied by land, since the waters were controlled by British and French warships. Even with approximately 125,000 peasant carts requisitioned to supply the defenders from their own adjacent homeland, their limited supplies of ammunition did not permit them to reply in kind to the barrages fired at them from the sea.
Hmm.
Nor was this simply a matter of conditions favoring attackers or defenders in general. Both in Spain and in Russia, Napoleon's attacking armies met disaster when they had to be supplied over land, while the opposing armies were supplied across water. The inaccessibility.
So let me just go back and hear that again because I want to make sure I heard him right about Napoleon.
Napoleon's attacking armies met disaster when they had to be supplied over land, while the opposing armies were supplied across water.
That's true and kind of not true. Like, if Napoleon didn't invade Russia and go so far and deep into Russia, he would have been fine. Because for his whole career, he was supplied by land. But he did his armies in such a way. And honestly, the way he did his army is why we have divisions and such things now. He completely redefined the military. Part of what he got was from previous military people in France at the time before him, but he really revolutionized it and used it to the maximum degree at the time. So like he was fine on land. It was just until he went to Russia and he went so far in the Russian renter. That's what got us as a Russian renter, and he had to retreat with no supplies and getting chased by armies is when he fell apart. So it's not him just being on land. It's a lot of different factors. But I get what he's saying.
The inaccessibility of African rivers to ocean-going warships made this continent less vulnerable to European naval power than much of the Western Hemisphere was. The Dutch, for example, could send ocean-going vessels more than 100 miles up the Hudson River to establish an outpost at what would later become the city of Albany. No river in Africa was that accessible, whether due to insufficient water levels or, more commonly, sandbars, cascades, and waterfalls. The shallow coastal waters in many parts of sub-Saharan Africa meant that large European warships could often not get close enough to the shore in many places, necessitating the loading of European troops into smaller boats, which could in many places be effectively opposed by Africans in similar-sized boats, particularly in the early centuries before European firearms had developed the accuracy and speed of firing that they would have in later eras. The history of the British people, like the history of other peoples around the world, illustrates the enormous importance of human capital, whether in the form of specific skills, general education, or traditions and laws that facilitate both economic development and the development of free institutions. The many centuries that it took for the British to rise from cultural and economic backwardness to the forefront of world civilization in technology and political dominance suggests something of the difficulty of acquiring the necessary human capital. The vital role played in this process by numerous other peoples who came to the British Isles, whether as conquerors, immigrants, or refugees, also suggests how important cultural diffusion is. The Romans, the Normans, the Jews, the Lombards, and the Huguenots all contributed in important ways at different historical junctures to what would ultimately become a British achievement. The geography of the British Isles also played an important role, not in determining what people would do, but in determining the boundaries of what was possible. The simple fact that Britain is an island nation, and that water transport is vastly cheaper than land transport, and was especially so in the era before railroads, meant that the British could transport heavy raw materials like coal to different parts of the United Kingdom much more cheaply and rapidly than was possible within nations with large interiors such as Germany or the United States, both of which had to wait for the era of railroads to challenge the British in industrialization.
Mm.
The fact that the key raw materials of the industrial age, iron ore and coal, were located very near each other and also near navigable waterways in Britain again gave the British decisive early advantages over countries like Germany and the United States, as well as
Mhm.
permanent advantages over regions of the world where such natural resources do not exist at all and cannot be imported at any feasible economic cost.
Mhm.
Significantly, Japan, one of the few
Yep.
countries that was later able to rise to the industrial forefront without such natural resources, is an island like Britain, and no part of Japan is more than 70 miles from the sea, so imported raw materials could be brought in economically, as would be virtually impossible in the Balkans or in much of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, due to more formidable geographical barriers in these places. Geographical advantages and cultural imports have permitted more to be accomplished within the British Isles than in many other parts of the world, but ultimately it was the British themselves who had to accomplish it. That they did so has had enormous consequences, not only for the inhabitants of the United Kingdom or even for past and present members of the British Empire or Commonwealths, but for the entire world. The highly varying degrees to which different segments of the British population acquired the necessary human capital demonstrates that the opportunity alone is not sufficient for economic or other accomplishments. Nor was it simply a matter of what the existing society permitted to different groups, for those same groups showed similar economic and social patterns when transplanted to other societies in North America or in Australia and New Zealand. British law and its traditions of impartiality made London a magnet for the capital of the world, enabling Britain to industrialize with other people's capital as well as its own. In a later era, the British colony of Hong Kong would similarly attract capital from around the world by the dependability and impartiality of its laws, while many poverty-stricken countries were unable to obtain much-needed capital because of their undependable laws and confiscatory policies toward foreign investors. British law was of course more than an economic asset. Its separation of powers and rights of citizens against the government were the foundation of the freedom of the British themselves. The revolutions of the 17th century, including the beheading of King Charles I in 1649 and the uprisings in 1688 that led James II to flee to France, made the separation of powers even more dramatically vindicated and an indelible part of the British Constitution. While many other countries copied British systems of law and government, those that succeeded in creating similarly free governments were largely those that came from the same tradition: the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, for the historical experiences that were distilled into powerful traditions were essential to the functioning of the legal and political institutions themselves. While these institutions could be copied by anyone, the history and traditions behind them could not be synthesized, and it was these intangibles that made the tangible institutions and structures work.
Hmm. That was a very good and interesting video. I just stayed silent for the last half because a lot of stuff he was saying I wasn't that aware of. I'm not that aware of like the natural resources of Great Britain. I just more focused on the military side and then the politics that play into the military. I did find it very interesting too how he mentioned how the British people threw off their king and they fought for more rights and separations of powers. It's very similar to the Roman story, and that's kind of ironic too because the Romans conquered Britain and then they fell apart. And when they fell apart with emperors, not with a senate or a like assembly. I can't think of what the like a House of Commons. I think that's what they call it in Great Britain. So it was a complete opposite. But Rome didn't get big until they threw off their kings, and then they had a few wars with Carthage, and then they spread the ideas and so forth. Then they got an emperor, and then they eventually fell apart due to multiple factors. But Great Britain, they eventually had kings again, threw that off and expanded. It's just kind of funny how sometimes in a little bit of ways history repeats itself. And that's why I think so many people need to study it and learn about it more, because it is very valuable knowledge to learn about and have in your tool belt. But that's it for now. It's your boy Logos, and I'll talk to y'all next time.